Sinbad's ship ran aground on a green and silent island, and the sailors wept with relief. They should have stayed afraid, because something was already coming down through the trees to meet them, and it was looking at the crew the way a starving man looks at a feast. If you know his name at all, you know Sinbad the Sailor as a man who could not stay on dry land. 7 times he sailed from Baghdad, a wealthy man, and 7 times he came home with nothing but his life and a story no one quite believed. This is the third of those voyages, the one he almost did not live to tell. He had sworn after the last wreck that he was finished with the sea. He had felt the ground of a sleeping whale shudder beneath his feet. He had seen a bird large enough to blot out the sun. He had seen enough. But wealth has a short memory, and a restless heart has a long one. Before the season turned, Sinbad had sold his goods, kissed his quiet life goodbye, and boarded a heavy merchant ship bound for the far ports of the east. For many days the wind was kind. And then, all at once, it was not. The storm came without warning. It tore the sails to ribbons, snapped the mast like a reed, and drove the battered ship for 3 days through black water until, at dawn, it ground to a halt on the rocks of an island no chart had ever named. The survivors dragged themselves onto the sand and lay there, breathing, alive. The island was green and full of fruit trees, and for a few hours it felt like mercy. But Sinbad had survived too much to trust a gift, and he noticed what the others did not. No birds sang. Paths were worn into the grass, too wide for any deer. And inland, half hidden by the trees, stood a great house of black stone, its doorway tall enough to swallow a ship's sail whole. Whatever built it was not a man. The crew told themselves they would rest one night, only one, and sail at first light on whatever they could lash together. They lit a fire. They did not know the fire would be seen. It came as the last light bled out of the sky. The ground shook with each step before they ever saw it. And then it was there, filling the doorway of the black house. A giant, tall as a palm tree, with skin like cracked leather and eyes that glowed like 2 coals pulled fresh from a furnace. Its mouth split open over teeth like a wild boar's tusks. Its hands ended in nails curved like a lion's claws. No one screamed. There was no time. The giant walked among the frozen men the way a farmer walks among his flock, weighing them in the firelight. Then it reached down and lifted the ship's captain, the largest, best fed of them all, as easily as a man lifts a chicken from a coop. What it did next, by the fire, in full view of the others, does not need to be described. It is enough to say that when the giant had eaten its fill, it lay down across the only door and slept, and its snoring shook dust from the rafters. The sailor sat in the dark among the bones and understood that the door was now a wall. Daylight brought no rescue. The giant rose, stepped over the men as though they were furniture, and went out into the island. And the survivors found that the doorway by day would let them pass. They ran. They tore down to the shore and searched the coast for any way off that island, and found none. Only cliffs and open sea, and no wood long enough to carry them all. By dusk they crept back, because outside was no safer than in, and a man cannot run forever. And the giant returned and lit its fire, and chose again, the heaviest first, always as if saving the lean ones for later. Night after night a man was taken, and the rest lay in the dark, doing the cruel arithmetic of who was fatter than whom, and how many nights that bought them. Some of the men simply stopped speaking. Sinbad did not. Somewhere in that horror, while the others surrendered, he had begun to watch the giant. The way it moved, the way it slept, the things it left lying by its fire. Here is what Sinbad had noticed. The giant ate until it could barely move, then slept the heavy, helpless sleep of a thing that has never once been afraid. And beside its fire stood the tools of its butchery, long iron spits, each as thick as a man's leg, made for turning a body over the flames. Iron, Sinbad thought, iron and a sleeping monster, and a fire that never goes out. He gathered the few men who still had the will to listen, and he spoke low and fast. They could not outrun it. They could not outfight it with their hands. But a giant has the same weakness as any creature that ever walked the earth. Its eyes. Blinded, and the strength of 10 men becomes the flailing of a frightened beast. They would wait until it had gorged and fallen into that deep sleep, heat the spits in its own fire, until the points glowed white, and then all together, in the single moment they would ever get, put out its eyes. For the first time in many nights, something other than despair moved through that black house. It was a terrible plan. It was the only one they had. That night they let it feed. They made themselves watch, and they waited, and they hated every second of the waiting, until at last the giant stretched out across the doorway, and its breathing slowed into that deep, grinding snore. Sinbad rose. He took the longest of the iron spits and laid its point in the heart of the fire, and the others did the same, and they crouched there turning the iron while the metal went from black to red to a white that hurt to look at. Then Sinbad lifted his spit from the flames, and the men lifted theirs, and on his signal they drove them down with all the strength that terror gives, deep into the giant's burning eyes. The sound it made was not a sound any of them would ever forget. The giant came up off the floor blind and shrieking, swinging its great arms through the dark, clutching at its ruined face, smashing the black stone walls to rubble as it tried to find the small creatures that had hurt it. But it could not see. The men were already moving. Out through the broken doorway it no longer guarded, down through the trees in the dark, running for the shore and the clumsy rafts they had lashed together in secret against exactly this one chance. They had almost made it. The rafts were in the water, the men paddling with their hands, the black house burning behind them, when they heard the giant's voice carry across the island, calling. And out of the dark came a second of its kind, its mate. The two giants found the cliffs above the shore, blind and seeing, and they began to tear loose boulders the size of oxen and hurl them out toward the sound of splashing in the water. The first stone fell short, the second did not. It came down through the dark and shattered a raft and the men clinging to it, and they were simply gone, swallowed without a trace. Another stone and another raft broke apart. The sea churned white with falling rock and drowning men. Sinbad paddled with bleeding hands, not daring to call out, steering by the current and the faint line of the horizon, while around him in the dark the cries of his companions went silent one by one. When dawn came, the island was a smudge far behind him. Of all the men who had washed ashore on that cursed coast, 3 were still alive. Sinbad and 2 others, clinging to the last raft on an empty sea. The current carried them 2 more days. They had no food, no water, no oars, only the raft and the sun, and the slow certainty that the sea would finish what the giant had begun. And then on the 3rd morning, there was land. Another island, green again, beautiful again, rising out of the water like a promise. The 3 of them wept for the 2nd time on that voyage, and for the 2nd time they should have been afraid. Because Sinbad had learned by now what a beautiful and silent island usually means. They dragged the raft up the sand. They ate the fruit. They drank from a clear stream. And as the light failed and they huddled together to sleep, Sinbad lay awake, watching the tree line. And somewhere in the dark beyond the firelight, slow and heavy and vast, something moved through the undergrowth toward them. The 3rd voyage was not done with him yet. Sinbad survived that giant, and the island after it, and the sea after that, and came home to Baghdad once more, richer than before, and by his own telling, more dead than alive. That was the price of every voyage. He gave the sea his crew, his cargo, and his peace, and it gave him back a story. This was only the 3rd of 7. The rest are darker still. A valley floored with diamonds and guarded by serpents, an old man who climbs onto a traveler's shoulders and will not climb down, a city where the living bury themselves with the dead. If you want to hear where the current takes him next, stay with me after nightfall and follow the channel, and I will tell you the next voyage of Sinbad the Sailor by lamplight. Until then, sleep well. The sea is a long way from here.